Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome, everyone, to the Sports Spectrum podcast. My name is Jason Romano. I really appreciate you joining us here on the program today. Before we get to our interview with Jacie Hoyt, the University of Missouri Kansas City women's head basketball coach, I want to tell you about a deal we have going on with Sports Spectrum and the Sports Spectrum magazine. Go to sportspectrum.com. That's the place to go for all of our content here at Sports Spectrum. And it's, again, sportspectrum.com. Check out the articles there. Read the first-person accounts from athletes, the daily devotionals, the stories on the intersection of sports and faith. But even more than that, we want to encourage you to subscribe to our magazine. It's a quarterly magazine. It's $18 for an entire year. And maybe you just got a little extra cash after that Christmas holiday and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's a way I can really be a part of something bigger than myself, be a part of something that I can share with someone else, and be a part of something that intersects the world of sports and the world of faith. And that's the Sports Spectrum magazine. $18 for an entire year. What a deal. $18. Go to sportspectrum.com, subscribe, partner with us, become a part of the Sports Spectrum family. I promise you, you'll love the magazine. Sportspectrum.com is the place to go and subscribe today. Our guest on the podcast today is Jacie Hoyt. She's the University of Missouri Kansas City women's basketball coach. She was named the head coach on May 11th, 2017. She's in her second season there. She also happens to be the youngest Division I coach in the country. And before she came to UMKC, she was an assistant coach at Kansas State as well as Nevada. And she's also a former player and a team captain point guard with Wichita State, the Shockers, back in 2006 to 2009. And at high school, at Hoxie High School, she was pretty darn good. 2016 career points scored in just 3 seasons. And she was a 3-time All-State performer in basketball and volleyball. She is the daughter, if you're in Kansas, you probably know this name, Shelly Hoyt. She's the daughter of Shelly Hoyt, the high school coaching legend. And Shelly has been a part of a team record, 107 straight wins. That's actually a state record, not just a team record, and 4 straight state titles. So the pedigree is there, and Jacie learned from one of the best in her mom, Shelly. And Jacie joins us here on the podcast. We just talk about her journey a little bit. What's it like to be the youngest head coach in Division I basketball for women, and also just how she goes about coaching. What's her philosophy? How does she take what she learned as a player, take what she learned as an assistant, and then carry that over now as the head coach at UMKC? And I also asked her about her faith, certainly growing up, but even more now. What does that look like? How does she bring faith into the locker room? How does she bring faith into her daily duties as a head coach? What does that look like? How does she live her life as a follower of Christ and also as a basketball coach? So good stuff here from Jacie. She also faced some heartache and some trauma and some trials, as we all do, during her basketball playing career and her seasons and her career in college at Wichita State. Took a little tumble. She had some injuries, some pretty big injuries, actually, that affected how good she probably could have been. And she talks about those and what she learned from those and what she learned from the Lord during that time as well. Good stuff here from Jacie Hoyt. Let's learn about Jacie. Let's hear her journey here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Take a listen. Jacie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you. The youngest Division I coach in the country. I got that from a reliable source, meaning your husband, who told me this. And it's interesting to me because you've been in the job now for a year and a half. I know you came in May of 2017. And certainly, I think just looking from my research, you've been intentional about facing the tough competition early on. Even this season, you faced the Kansas Jayhawks, a place where your husband works, as we mentioned, your husband. How has this experience been for you, being the head coach at the University of Missouri, Kansas City?
It's been so fun, very challenging, just like any job is challenging. But it's just been a blast, honestly. We're really young this year. We've got 10 new players, 7 of those being freshmen. So a lot of growing up to do, a lot of maturation that needs to happen. And, you mentioned we played KU. We played K-State, where I formerly worked. And then tomorrow we actually go to Mizzou. So like you said, very challenging, but I love giving experiences and opportunities like that to our team to just really kind of show them, what it takes to play at the highest level and give them those kind of big time experiences, I think is really good. And I think those games, you have to be intentional about how you do it from a coaching strategy, but, you can just learn so much from those games. And I think it really kind of expedites that maturity process that I was mentioning.
Was it a little weird going and playing against the team that your husband works for? Was there a little competition going on there about, his school versus your school? How did that go over?
Well, I'll just be very transparent with you. I've never been a KU fan. I grew up a Nebraska football fan because my mom's side of the family is from there, and so then we lived in Kansas, and I played at Wichita State. Yep. I was a shocker, and then I worked at K-State, and so I was very upfront with him from the beginning. I said, I really like you, but you need to understand that there's really no part of me that has ever cheered for KU and probably will cheer for KU. So he knew that going in, and but at the end of the day, he's coming home to me. So I think he was smart enough to recognize that.
Absolutely. Now, I wonder with the competition. Is that something you saw even in your experiences? You were in Nevada, you were in Kansas State as an assistant, certainly playing at Wichita State. Was that something that you saw was a benefit to playing the higher level of competition, if you will, early on in November and December to get ready for the rigors of conference play?
I can't even really say that. I mean, I certainly see the advantages now. When I played a lot of those games last year. In my first year, I really just kind of inherited that schedule. I got the job late and inherited some of those games and really just kind of had to fill our schedule. It just so happened to be that way. And this year, it was pretty exciting because we're able to get K-State and Mizzou as a return game. And I just think that's going to be such an awesome opportunity for our team and our community to have those higher level teams coming in to our home court. So it really just kind of played out that way. I can't even say that I was trying to be intentional about it. It just played out that way.
Jacie Hoyt is our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Let's learn about you a little bit more in your journey. You kind of touched on it growing up, family in Nebraska, and you grew up, I know, in Missouri. Tell us about basketball and when that really became a big part of your life. I know that's in the family and your mom was a coach, but tell us about basketball growing up and falling in love with the game.
Yeah, so my mom has been a high school basketball coach for as long as I remember, and it's really, basketball has just been ingrained in me. It's been ingrained in my whole family. Growing up after school every single day, my sister and I, we would just go to the gym knowing that our mom was running practice there. And my dad was a football coach and a basketball coach. My mom always coached basketball. And so we just were always really submerged in sports, period, but especially basketball. And I didn't even realize everything that I was learning, even in those younger years, as a second, third, fourth grader. Just getting to be around role models and, getting to learn from my mom when maybe I didn't realize that I was learning from her and learning about the game. But it was really something that I didn't have a choice with. That's just what we did. But I wouldn't change that for the world. And obviously it's got me to the place that I'm at now. So I'm really thankful for that.
And then when you get to your high school years and you start playing basketball, you're pretty good. Is it Hoxie High School? Hoxie? How do you pronounce that?
Yep, you're right. It's Hoxie High. Mm-hmm.
3 seasons there, 2,000 career points. Yeah, it's pretty good. So at some point, you're realizing, okay, I've been around this game a lot and I know a lot about the game, but I can play it too. Tell me about growing into that and sort of maturing into a pretty good basketball player.
That started for me when I was really young. I was kind of a weird kid. I always wanted to be great. I did. Growing up in Kansas, I was fortunate enough to get to watch Jackie Stiles, who is one of the greatest, female basketball players. I'll even say basketball players, period, to ever play. And, I got to watch my mom coach against her and watched a lot of her games. And I was about fourth grade when I first saw Jackie play. And I knew that I wanted what she had. I kind of became obsessed with it, honestly, and knew that her daily regimen was to make 1,000 shots a day. And so as a little kid, I was doing that. I mean, it would take me hours and hours, but I would make 1,000 shots a day in my younger years in elementary school. I stopped drinking pop when I was in fourth grade, and I haven't had a pop since.
Wow.
There was kind of, I don't know, I guess I was just weird, but I loved, I had such a passion for the game. I had such a passion for wanting to be really good at it. And, in high school, I had a good career. It was fun getting to play for my mom, and we had a lot of success, but it really kind of was just, I would say, never enough for me, honestly. I always just wanted to be better and felt like there was more that I could be achieving. And I think that's really kind of when I grew, I would say, in my faith. And we can get to that later. But, my college career, I had a really great, successful high school career. And then college comes about, and I kind of was dealt a pretty rough hand. And that's when I realized, okay, this game, I'm not going to have it forever. And I really kind of went through some identity issues because, like I told you, I mean, what grade school kid is spending, 5-6 hours in the gym every day?
Yeah.
So it was really kind of an interesting path for me that started really, really young.
So at what point now, as you get to, I guess you said you were dealt a pretty bad hand in college. So let's start with that and what happened, because you get to Wichita State, and I know that you were a team captain, a point guard there, but you said you were dealt a bad hand. Can you elaborate on that and share what happened?
Sure. Coming out of high school, I signed to play at Oklahoma State, actually. I signed in the fall of my senior year, and that spring, there was a coaching change at Oklahoma State that really kind of made me rethink my decision and want to go elsewhere. At the time, I was just obsessed with playing Big 12 basketball. That was kind of my dream and the whole goal for me. So I ended up going to a junior college that was just down the road that was really successful at the time, and kind of thought that would be my ticket to get back in. In that year, I was not able to play because I blew out my knee. Had a really bad knee injury. I've had several, but that was the worst. Especially at that time, I had to have microfracture surgery and just really kind of shredded the whole thing. Doctors told me, that I shouldn't play again, and if I did, just to not like to ever really be the same. I kind of took that as a challenge and didn't really listen, and of course went on to play. But it started then, it started with coaching change. It started with that knee injury. The following year, I went to Wichita State and was really fortunate to get to play for an incredible coach and person there. Her name was Jane Albright. And then when I got there, though, I broke my leg in one of the first games back. So when I say I was dealt a bad hand, it was like injury after injury. Following year, there was another coaching change. And then the last 2 years, I tore my ACL back-to-back years. So I make fun of myself. I call myself the Greg Oden of college women's basketball because there was a lot of hype, about me coming out of high school. And then I only got to play 2 years out of 6. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty rough.
Jacie, tell me about your faith, where it started. And I think then eventually it will take us to your faith being impacted by the hand, quote unquote, that you're dealt in college. But tell us about where the faith was rooted, where you started to realize who Jesus was and church and salvation, all of that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, growing up, my family, we went to church and, small town. So it was really funny growing up because we had the gym across the street and then the church right to the side of our house. So we would just, that was our life. We'd go to church on Sundays and then over to the gym every other day. But I did go to church growing up, and my parents are just incredible. I could have a whole podcast on how awesome my parents are. But I would say for me personally, although I understood faith and would say I understood having a personal relationship with Jesus, I really didn't take it serious or I guess see a need in it. And the reason I say that is because I really just kind of always had everything. Basketball was everything to me. Sports was everything to me. And when I was successful in those, I really just, that's kind of what I poured my life into. And then, as I mentioned before, when I got to college and all of a sudden, didn't have that and realized that there was a lot more to life than just basketball or some of the things that I was putting my identity into, that's when I really took it serious. And I think it honestly just kind of took me falling to my knees and not having that game that I had put my whole life into, since I was a little kid. And there was really just kind of nowhere for me to look but up at that point. And that's when I really started to understand what that personal relationship looked like, finding fulfillment in something that this world could never offer me. And as I mentioned before, I got to play for Jane Albright, who she was my head coach at Wichita State for 2 years. And she really just had a tremendous impact on me and taught me what it looked like to just really live that out and live it out through being an athlete, through being a coach, and kind of helping me understand that you could do both. So that's really, I credit a lot of where I'm at to her and the way that she helped me grow in that.
And then as the college basketball career winds down, you go into coaching and you start with Nevada, as far as I see here in the bio that I had, go to Kansas State and then become the head coach at Missouri, Kansas City. So tell me about coaching and kind of following in your mom's footsteps, but still trying to carve out your own path as well. And maybe some of the lessons you learned from that.
Yeah, well, I would say in sitting out so much as a player, I would really kind of say that's what jump-started my coaching career. It just gave me a different perspective. I was able to watch the game differently, and so I would actually say that it started there. When I worked at Nevada, I worked for Jane. She went from Wichita State to Nevada and hired me out there. And so once again, got to learn a lot from her out there. I spent 3 years out there, and then at K-State, I learned so much, but that was a really unique opportunity for me to get to come back to my home state and be closer to family. If you would have told me that I would be the head coach at UMKC just a few years later, I would have said, you're crazy. That was really never in my plan at all. I loved my time everywhere I was and really just believe in just, being where your feet are. And it's crazy how it played out. But my mom, man, that's the biggest compliment that someone could give me, is to say that I'm, kind of following in her footsteps. And obviously she's at the high school level, but, she has had the biggest impact on me just when it comes to coaching, and, the ways that she's taught me to just work hard and, treat people really, really well. And the way that she has invested over her players for as long as I can remember, I would say really just gave me a head start once again at an early age to see what it takes to be great, and I'm not saying that I'm great, but my mom is great, and I know what greatness looks like through her. So she really, I always joke with her, she's the real MVP, the Kevin Durant speech, because she is. I mean, there's no way I would be where I'm at without her.
What has been the biggest difference for you, Jacie, going from being an assistant, now you're in your second year as a head coach? What is the biggest difference you see from being a coach to the head coach?
I think the biggest difference is really probably just the amount of decisions that you have to make on a daily basis, and then the weight of those decisions. There, as an assistant, it's just, you have your kind of one or two areas that you really focus on. And as a head coach, obviously you're running the show in every single way. And when things don't go right, you're the person that, is looked to. And when things go well, it's kind of everybody else is, you're putting it back on them. And so really, I would say it's, honestly, I love it. It's kind of lonely sometimes, I would say. But I wouldn't change that at all. And, but I think at the end of the day, it's really just kind of boils down to the amount of decisions that I have to make, and then the weight that those decisions carry.
What is the Bible verse or story for you that has encouraged you the most in your walk with the Lord?
Jeremiah 29:11 is a verse that I've really always relied on. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. In reflecting on the playing career that we've been talking about, I would say in those times, it was hard. It was really hard. And, it was dark. I didn't understand it. I didn't want to understand it, but now, just being able to look back and see what God was doing in those times, and the ways that he was growing me and molding me and shaping me. I just believe in that verse with all my heart. And, when you talk about hope, I love that verse, because now when things don't seem to go my way, I just have so much hope knowing the ways that he worked everything out for my good, kind of through that adversity that I had faced. So that's definitely my favorite verse that I rely on a lot.
Jacie, how do you bring your faith into your job? Because obviously you're hired to do a job. You're not hired to be a preacher or a pastor, but in many ways you are, in terms of pastoral care for your players. But how do you balance that? How do you bring your faith into the locker room? Because we're called to take our faith everywhere we go, but at the same time, to make sure you don't alienate your players, those that might not be believers, might believe something different. How do you balance all that and bring it with you when you go into the locker room as a coach?
I was so fortunate to get to learn. I keep talking about Jane Albright, but I have to, because I was so fortunate to get to learn from her in that sense. It's important for me, I think, to not feel the need to necessarily talk about it as much as just walk that talk and live it out, and just be a daily kind of living example of Jesus. And I certainly don't have that mastered. I fail at that every day and kick myself. I shouldn't have said this, that, but I feel such a strong sense of purpose every day that I wake up to just get to go and live the way that I think Jesus wants me to live, and that he would live. And so I think it's more so just about how we love others and how we serve others. today's society is so me. And, of course, you can't be that, especially when you're playing a team sport. You always have to put the we over the me. But I think society, again, just tells us that it's all about you and, whether that be through social media or whatever. So I think the more that I can just continue to put my players first, my staff first, and just put other people before me, I think that that's a great way to kind of show them. And I talk about my faith in certain circumstances, but it is very important for me to not pressure anyone or make them feel like I'm forcing what I believe onto them. So I'm really conscious and mindful not to do that. But I think it's just more so about the way that we live our life. And, it's so neat because I do have a lot of players come to me and ask me certain questions, just knowing where I stand and wanting to know more. And that's where Jane helped me so much because I was so hungry. I was so just curious on a lot of different things when I played for her. And so just knowing, that she was a believer, I would ask her a lot. And then, of course, that would open the door for her to tell me. And so I've been fortunate to share a lot of things with my players as well.
A couple more questions here with Jacie Hoyt, the University of Missouri Kansas City women's basketball coach here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Jacie, how do you stay, I guess, fed in the Lord is the best word, because you are the leader, you're the head coach, you're doing so much pouring into others. How do you stay poured into? How do you continue to reach out and get advice, leadership, even just staying fed biblically, spiritually during a long basketball season? How does that look for you?
That is a great question, and I'm still trying to figure out how to balance that on some days.
Yeah.
But for me, it's important that I start my day off with just getting into the Word, and some days that looks different than others. I love devotionals. I just love, the short reads and just those good reminders that I can carry on throughout my day. Honestly, listening to a lot of podcasts. I listen to your podcast a lot, and but just listening to different sermons and things like that on my phone. So if I'm in the car or I'm getting ready for work, I just make it a habit to always try and feed myself, whether it be listening to a sermon or being fortunate enough to get to have that time to sit down and read my Bible or my devotionals. But you have to make the time, and that gets really hard sometimes if, especially if you got an early morning practice, and I can't necessarily say I'm a morning person. So I have to be very intentional about getting up earlier than I want to in order to do that. But man, I can tell a huge difference in myself throughout the day when I have made that time and when I haven't made that time. And then prayer is so important to me. And I can tell a difference when I'm praying and when I'm not. And somebody told me something really good. I think I was a player actually when I heard this, but they said it's hard to not like someone or be mad at someone if you're praying for them. And I loved that because it was so true. And when you start to pray for someone, no matter how you feel about them, you can feel yourself changing. You can feel yourself changing your mindset toward that person. And it's not that I don't ever like my players or my staff, but, there's frustrating days and there are times when you feel like maybe they're not producing the way that they should be or could be, and you're frustrated. And so it's really important for me to pray for my players a lot. And I make sure to do that before every game. I try and do it on a daily basis. And I can definitely, again, tell a difference when I go into that practice or that game in how I'm coaching them individually and as a team when I've been praying for them, and I'm seeing them through the eyes of Jesus. And it helps me be a lot more patient and understanding, and just gives me that perspective. So prayer is also, I would say, really big for me. And just maybe I can't always have the time to read what I want to read or listen to what I want to listen to, but you can pray at any time. And so I try and be really conscious of that. And I'm fortunate because that just kind of comes natural to me.
Last question here, and this has been great talking to you, Jacie. And if you know this podcast, I think you know where I'm going. But what are you learning from the Lord right now, where God has you? What's He been teaching you lately?
Galatians 6:9. Do not become weary in doing the right thing, and just knowing that at the proper time, we're all going to reap our harvest. And that has been big for me because we talked about our schedule early on in the podcast, and whether we like it or not, we are, as coaches, most often based off or evaluated off of our wins and losses. And so when you're taking some of those L's, it is hard. It's hard to keep perspective. And so I've really just been relying on that verse and trying not to become weary in doing the right thing. And He's just helping me to remember that and know that in the big picture, things are all going to play out. And so he's teaching me patience and just to not become weary in doing the right thing.
Jacie, thanks for joining us here in the podcast. Been great to get to know you, and I just wish you nothing but the best, and we'll talk again soon, I hope.
Thank you so much, Jason. It was my pleasure.
Many thanks to Jacie Hoyt, the University of Missouri Kansas City women's basketball coach, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Jacie is awesome. I really enjoyed talking to her, hear her story, hear her journey. The youngest Division I coach in the country, and I'll give you a little behind the scenes and behind the curtain on the podcast. So at the end of the taping, I actually said to her, do you like hearing that? Do you like hearing the name of, the moniker, I guess, of the youngest head coach in the country? And I took it out, and I felt a little uneasy that I had to bring that up again and kind of ask her to answer that. She answered it with class and certainly was gracious in her answer, but I could tell that she doesn't even think about it. She's got a job to do, just like so many of us do, and she's clearly qualified for the job, or she wouldn't have gotten it. So I took it out, and again, it was like 15 seconds. It wasn't a big deal, but I just felt like it wasn't needed for this podcast because Jacie has accomplished so much, and I didn't need to put that label on her at the end again, as she was graciously finishing our interview. So grateful to her. Give her a follow on Twitter at Coach Jacie, and Jacie is spelled Jacie, Coach Jacie on Twitter. And let her know you heard her story here on the podcast, and give her a follow and follow along on all the great things she's doing with UMKC. Thanks to Jacie for being a guest here. Thanks to you for listening. As always, you can reach us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook at sports_spectrum. You can reach me directly, jason@sportsspectrum.com. jason@sportsspectrum.com is my email. Email me if you have any questions, any thoughts about a possible guest for the podcast, and anything you want to talk about. Just email me about the podcast. I'd love to hear from you. jason@sportsspectrum.com. Also want to encourage you to go to sportsspectrum.com. That's our website. Daily content's on there, our daily devotional articles all day long on the intersection of sports and faith. First-person articles, increase articles on John 3:30, he must increase, we must decrease, from athletes themselves. Really great stuff there. And you can also subscribe on sportsspectrum.com to our magazine. It's $18 for an entire year. It's the best deal you'll find around for the content that you're getting on the intersection of sports and faith with the Sports Spectrum magazine. Check it out over at sportsspectrum.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Have a great rest of your day.